Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today I'm going to show you how to replace the front wheel bearings in my 2013 F150. I'm going to show you a few things you should do, as well as a few things that you should watch out for. This is going to be pretty straightforward, so let's jump right in. Look for these two bolts. One is an 8mm and the other is a 10mm. Those need to be removed to give yourself some slack in the ABS line. This line runs from your ABS wheel speed sensor in your wheel bearing up this way to the top of the wheel liner, and we will remove that later in the video. And yes, if you purchase new wheel bearings, they do come with this line, so you don't have to remove the sensor itself. Let's start with a 10mm bolt that holds the brake hose bracket in place. This will give you plenty of room to push that brake caliper out of the way after removing it. Alright, that bolt is off, and now you should be able to pull the bracket out. Do you see this part of the bracket that extends out? This helps hold the line in place when we put everything back together. I'll show you what I mean later in the video. Push that out of the way and then get ready to disconnect the bolt for the ABS line. This is an 8mm. For this bolt, I'm going to use an open-ended wrench. You can use a socket, however, it's difficult to get one in there because of how close this rubber clamp is to the bolt. Once that is free, the line will have more slack in it, just like this. You can remove the rest, but I'm going to stop there because I don't want the line to constantly get in the way while I'm working. We will get back to it in a little bit. Alright, now we're going to start spraying bolts and nuts down with some penetrating fluid. Pretty much anything you see on the back side here, including this nut on the tie rod end, needs to be sprayed down to make removal a lot easier. But the fluid can't penetrate if there's a lot of dirt and rust everywhere, like on my truck. So what I'm going to do is grab my brake cleaner and spray down these parts. Then I'll grab my wire brush to help remove some of that rust that may prohibit the penetrating fluid from, well, penetrating. Little side note here, make sure you are wearing safety glasses or something to protect your eyes, as well as a mask to prevent breathing in rust particles that will inevitably fly in the air. Once dry, you can grab your penetrating fluid and start soaking each nut and bolt. Make sure your can is upright or else it may start spraying like this. There we go, that's better. I'm also going to spray a little bit on the top of the tie rod right here. These tie rods can be a pain getting loose, which you will see in a little bit. While that's soaking, let's get this cap removed so we can have access to the axle nut. Most people use a flathead and jam it into the sides of the cap. However, I'm going to show you how to remove it with channel locks. I'm going to be installing a new cap, but if you need to reuse yours, this is a better way of removing the cap compared to jamming a flathead into the side. You want to keep moving around the cap while rocking the channel locks back and forth. Eventually, the cap will come loose and pop right out. Just like that. This is an old cap, and as you can tell, the inside edge has zero damage, so it can be reused again. The outside has some dents in it from the channel locks, but that's okay. This is in great shape to be reused. However, caps are cheap, and I decided to replace them anyway. Now let's remove that axle nut. This is a 13mm bolt, and I recommend using a deep socket like this so you don't hit the wheel studs while turning your wrench. Also, the wheel tends to turn with the axle nut as you are trying to loosen it, so I recommend hitting your wrench with the palm of your hand a few times in the counterclockwise direction. This should loosen it a little at a time until you can grab the top of the rotor to hold it in place as you loosen the nut the rest of the way. Eventually, it will loosen to the point where you can unscrew it by hand and remove it, just like that. You will notice the inside nut has red Loctite on the threads. Make sure your new nut has it too, as this will prevent the nut from loosening over time, which could cause severe damage to parts around this area. I'm going to remove the caliper as one unit by removing these two bolts for the caliper mounting bracket. These are 21mm. Make sure you start with the lower bolt first, or else the caliper will move too much at the top, making it difficult to keep it stable while removing the bottom bolt due to the weight of the caliper. Once that's removed, we can move on to the top bolt. Now, you do not want to completely remove this bolt until you find an area to rest the caliper, or until you are ready to mount the caliper out of the way safely without it dangling from the brake hose. I took mine out and screwed it back in until I was ready. I used these bungee cords to start, but quickly found out I needed something a little more stable to keep pressure off of that brake hose. You will see that in a bit. So I rested the caliper on the top of the hub and removed the rotor. Make sure you rest the rotor on something soft if you plan on reusing them. Now back to hanging the caliper. This would definitely be easier with caliper hooks, or if there's another person available to hold it while you feed a bungee or rope around it. Here is how it looks at this stage. As you can see, with this bracket detached from the mounting point, we have enough slack in the brake hose to push the caliper as far back as possible. This gives us plenty of room to get to the parts we need to remove. But I do not like the way the caliper looks with one bungee cord. So here is a revision I did off camera. As you can see, I have both of these hooks securing the caliper to the sway bar back here. This provides plenty of support as it does not move very much. Now let's remove the tie rod nut so our hub can freely move side to side. This is a 21mm. You might as well remove it all the way with your socket wrench or your impact because it would be too difficult to remove by hand due to the Loctite used from the factory. Once that's out of the way, you can grab a sledgehammer or a regular hammer and start hitting right here. This should technically help break the tie rod free. However, as you can see, my tie rod wanted to be a little difficult. I was hitting it with some decent force too, but the bushing would not break free. I even tried hitting this part of the tie rod, which you should never do as it can twist the rod and cause damage to the bushing. And you also don't want to hit the bottom like this because that could mushroom the end and make it difficult to get that nut back on. So I stopped with the risky methods and decided to try something different. I grabbed some penetrating fluid and sprayed right here where the bushing meets the hub. I also sprayed the threads underneath the knuckle, however, I'm not sure that did a lot. The fluid on top I believe was the most helpful. I'm going to let that soak in for a bit, but I want you to take note of the wheel position. Now the wheel is turned the other way as I needed more access to these bolts. I'll show you why that is important in a second. Now the tie rod is popped out of place. I believe it popped when I turned the wheel when trying to access that bolt. Let's keep going. Next, you want to get that ABS line loose and disconnected so you can completely remove the wheel bearing. So grab some kind of clip removal tool like this one and disconnect the line right here. Now on the center edge of your fender well, you will notice two white pins sticking out. You need to push these in or pull down on the electrical connector behind it just like that. There is a red tab you need to push out before you can disconnect. So grab your clip removal tool again, or even push it out with a fingernail if you can. Then you can disconnect the connector by pressing on this tab right here and then pulling them apart, just like that. The tab is right under this red clip. All you do is press down, pretty simple. Then you want to feed this wire through or pull it out of this area. And the only thing it should be connected to at this point is the wheel bearing. Now we can get the wheel bearing out of there. So grab your 18mm socket and preferably a breaker bar and begin loosening the bolts that secure the bearing to the hub. I would advise you do this before removing the upper control arm nut. As you can see, it's kind of a pain trying to loosen while the hub is moving around like this. Or if you have an impact, you can use that instead. This makes removing these bolts a lot easier. Once those are removed, you can grab your mallet and start hitting the side of the wheel bearing since this is an open area, and you do not have to worry about damaging anything else near it. After a few whacks, the bearing should fall out. You can move the ABS line before hitting the wheel bearing, or after like I did. You're just going to have to feed it between the dust shield and the hub. Now you can compare the new bearing to the old one. Make sure you also check the connector to make sure they are identical. Also, remove the red cap and then we can start putting everything back together. Before we just throw the wheel bearing back in, we want to clean up this area a bit. So grab your brake clean and spray the hub down. Then take a metal wire brush and begin removing the dust and debris around the mating surface. If there's too much debris on part of the hub and you install the new bearing, it's possible you can feel some vibrations due to the wheel bearing being slightly lopsided. This is a pretty rare situation, however you still want to make sure you do what you can to prevent this from happening. And make sure you run your fingers around the surface to catch any high spots that you may need to use your wire brush on. This area needed more attention, so I grabbed my wire brush again. Once that's done, spray your brake clean one more time and then wipe it down. Now we can apply our grease to the mating surface. You don't have to apply a lot, just enough to help keep out moisture. Plus it helps the wheel bearing slide into place easier too, just like that. That's all we need. So grab your wheel bearing and slide it into place. Then grab one of your bolts and begin threading it in to keep the wheel bearing from moving. Oh, and one more thing I should mention. You need to apply thread locker to these bolts since this is a high vibration area and you do not want to risk having these bolts get loose over time. That would be pretty bad if you were on the highway and they loosened. I'll get back to this in a little bit. Go ahead and hand tighten all 4 bolts. Then you can grab a wrench in your 18mm socket and start tightening them down. The torque spec on these bolts are 129 foot-pounds. You will see me attempt to use a torque wrench on these bolts a little later, but I ran into an issue. Now you will notice there is a gap between the hub and bearing, but don't worry, once you get these bolts tightened down, that gap will close. Oh, and make sure you route your ABS line correctly or else it may be difficult to move it later with these bolts torqued down. You also want to make sure you tighten these down in a crisscross pattern. Facing the hub, I tighten mine down as follows: top left, bottom right, bottom left, and finally top right. This will help keep the wheel bearing as flat as possible when sliding into the hub. Oh, and give the bearing a little spin just to make sure there aren't any weird noises coming out of it. Should probably do this before mounting it just in case you need to exchange it for another one. Do you remember earlier when I mentioned the wheel bearing bolts need thread locker because it's in a high vibration area? Yep, I'm going to apply that right now. Like I said earlier, this is pretty important, so make sure you do it to prevent the bolts from potentially backing out. Next, we need to grab one of our new axle nuts and begin screwing it onto the end of the axle that's poking through the center of the wheel bearing. Now we need to torque this nut down to 30 foot-pounds. While you are turning the axle nut, you will notice at some point the bearing begins to turn also, just like this. Now some people I've watched online will use a pry bar and wedge it between the wheel studs to keep it from moving. I personally don't like this idea because, as you may have guessed, you could damage the threads on the studs. So I decided to hold on to the studs while using a torque wrench with one hand. If you are unable to do this, you can ask someone to hold it, or if you have no other choice and need to use something like a pry bar, just make sure you wrap the threads completely with a towel, like a microfiber, to hopefully prevent any damage to the wheel studs. That can be done if you are very careful, but avoid it if you can. Alright, let's move on to something that is not necessary at all. I'm going to grab some grease and apply a decent amount around the axle nut. I'm not sure if I read somewhere this needed to be done, or if I was just used to doing it on older vehicles like my OBS F150, but I do know this can help keep moisture out, so I figured why not. Once that's done, we can move on to installing the cap. This is fairly simple, however, you need to pay attention to how you install it. You want to make sure it's perfectly straight before you start hammering it into place. You can use a mallet or a hammer, it doesn't really matter. Just make sure it's straight, or else you may damage the inside edge, which would make it difficult for it to securely stay in place. This is how it should look when it's installed correctly. Now we just need to clean it up a bit and then we can move on. Perfect, just like that. We will get to the rotor in a second, but I want to mention now is a good time to put thread locker on the caliper bolts. If you try to do this while holding the caliper in place, you will find it quite difficult. These calipers are heavy and will move around on you, so it's best to be prepared before you get to it. Alright, let's apply our anti-seize to the hub surface to prevent the rotor from sticking the next time we have to remove it. You just want a light coat and do not add any to the wheel studs. If you get some on them, just wipe it off with a rag or a towel. Once that's completely covered, you can grab your rotor and push it over the wheel studs. Then grab your anti-seize again and apply it to this part of the rotor. You do not want to get any on the surface that your brake pads touch. This will make it difficult to stop, as you can imagine. Again, just a light coat is all you need. And if you get any on the wheel studs like I did, just go ahead, like I said earlier, wipe it off. Alright, now we need to get that caliper back on. Make sure you put one lug nut on to help keep the rotor in place to make this easier. I'll show you what I mean. Oh, and do not press on the surface of the rotor or else you will get anti-seize everywhere. As you can see, trying to keep that rotor pressed back while installing the caliper is a chore. You really need to use two hands to handle the caliper, which is why screwing on one lug nut is such a convenient idea. It will prevent that rotor from moving, which is exactly what you want. Eventually, I was able to get the caliper lined up with the bracket and started threading the bolts in. Remember, if you haven't added thread locker to these bolts yet, make sure you do so. Once they are threaded in, you can torque these down to 184 foot-pounds. I just use my impact to tighten these bolts because I'm pretty sure my torque wrench is broken or needs to be recalibrated. I'll show you what I mean. I went to torque down the 4 wheel bearing bolts to 129 foot-pounds, but something did not feel right. This is a pretty long torque wrench, and I was able to spin these bolts without feeling any click to let me know it's properly torqued. Worried that I would snap the bolt in half, I stopped and tried the next bolt. Same thing happened. So I was pretty sure the torque wrench was not working properly. Regardless, make sure the 2 caliper bolts are torqued down to 184 foot-pounds and the 4 wheel bearing bolts are torqued down to 129 foot-pounds. Now we can connect that 10mm bolt for our brake hose bracket. Then grab your 10mm socket and snug it down. Just like that. Next is your ABS line. So grab that and see if it reaches the bracket that it screws into. If it doesn't, like mine, then it's snagged onto something and you need to free it. Mine was snagged on the brake dust shield. Once I was able to free it, it gave me just enough slack to get that 8mm bolt finger tight. Then you can grab your socket and snug it down. Now you can grab the wire and connect it to the connector up top. After it's connected, go ahead and push in those 2 white clips through the fender liner just like this. Alright, so as you can see, the footage is rather dark at this angle, so I'm just going to fast forward this part and then I will show you exactly where the wire needs to be clipped into. Now as I grab the camera, you will see the first clip gets pushed into this bracket and the other clip gets pushed in right here. This is how the wire should look, but you can also take a picture of the stock setup before starting this job so you can use it as a reference. Let's move on and get that tie rod nut back on. Just grab your tie rod and then maneuver the hub assembly to allow the tie rod end to slot into place. Just like that. Make sure you add some thread locker onto the threads too. Then grab your 21mm deep socket and torque this nut down to 85 foot-pounds. can now put your wheel back on. Make sure you tighten the lug nuts in a crisscross pattern and then torque them down to 125 foot-pounds. I already jacked up my truck and removed the wheel, so let's start by disconnecting the ABS line. Start with an 8mm wrench like this one. I tried to use the closed end, but it was too tight and won't fit, so use the open end to start. Then you can use the closed end to speed up the process if you have a set of ratcheting wrenches like these. These come in handy and I will link them down in the description below. Once that bolt is removed, you can grab a 10mm socket and get to work on the bolt that holds this bracket in place. Remove the bolt and then you should be able to pull the bracket out. Now grab your panel removal tool and use it on the 2 clips for your ABS line. Then we can move up to the fender liner and pull the connector out, just like that. Make sure you push the red locking tab out first before you try to disconnect it. Perfect. Then you want to push right here and pull the connectors apart. Next you want to pull the wire away from everything so it won't be in your way as you are removing parts. This part just pulls right out. Now we can begin working on the brake caliper. So grab your 21mm socket and loosen the 2 caliper bracket bolts. Don't remove the top bolt all the way as you don't want the caliper to fall after you remove the bottom bolt. This could put too much stress on the brake hose, which can cause leaks. And you want to make sure it's the top bolt that is left in, because if you leave the bottom bolt in, the caliper will still swing from top to bottom. So leave the top bolt in until you are ready to remove the whole unit. Once the bottom bolt is completely removed, you can get ready to remove the top bolt. But there are 2 things you want to do first. You want to give the caliper a twist like this. This will help push the brake pads in just enough so it's easier to pull off the rotor, which will also help a ton when you're ready to put the caliper back on. The next thing you want to do is get your caliper S-hook or whatever you are using to secure the caliper ready. The caliper has some weight to it, so try to get as prepared as you can to make this easier on you. If you have an S-hook, it should fit perfectly into the frame hole right here. My strap hooks did not fit, so I had to find another location. It took me a minute to figure out the best spot since I wanted to make sure the caliper would be far enough out of my way to not interfere with the job, but also high enough to prevent any stress on the brake hose. You also want to make sure you mount it on something that won't bend or break. I first placed the hook right here thinking it was far enough out of the way. However, as you can see, the caliper hung relatively low and I was worried about that brake hose. So I had to find another location. You can't see it right now because of the camera angle, but I hooked it around the upper control arm and it worked great. I'll show you that later. Let's begin loosening those wheel bearing bolts. I highly recommend you spray these down with some penetrating fluid. If they are still giving you trouble, grab a breaker bar or a pipe like I have right here. This should give you enough leverage to break those bolts free. Go ahead and remove all 4 bolts and then we can move on. You may think you can start hitting the wheel bearing off at this point. However, do not do that. You still need to remove the axle nut. So grab your channel locks and start by removing this cap. You want to move around the cap while prying up and down or side to side. This will eventually free the cap and give you access to the axle nut. You can also use a flathead screwdriver and hit the end with a hammer as most people do. However, if you want to reuse your caps, this is a much better method as it won't damage the inside edge. And just like that, the cap pops right off. Now we can remove the axle nut. This is a 13mm bolt and I recommend using a deep socket like this so you don't hit the wheel studs while turning your wrench. Also, the wheel tends to turn with the axle nut as you are trying to loosen it. So I recommend hitting your wrench with the palm of your hand a few times in the counterclockwise direction. Eventually it will loosen to the point where you can unscrew it by hand and remove it. Once the nut is removed, you should be able to pull the wheel bearing off. If you can't, just hit it with a hammer or mallet. Let's remove the nut for the outer tie rod. This is a 21mm. Having an impact in this situation helps a ton. You will notice some resistance as the nut gets closer to coming off. Just keep turning. There we go. Alright, here comes the fun part. You need to separate the tie rod from the hub. So grab your penetrating fluid and try to spray around the bushing like this, and then spray upwards on the threads. Now let it set for a few minutes and then we can try to free it. Alright, so I'm going to try something you should never do. I'm going to turn my truck on and turn the steering wheel from side to side in hopes of breaking the tie rod free. You can see right away how dangerous this is. Look how my truck rocked on the jack stand. I did not notice it while I was sitting in my truck, but after seeing the footage, I won't be doing that again. Of course, this part isn't in the camera's view, but you can see me hitting this part of the hub. This separated it perfectly. So I would advise you do that and do not move the steering wheel back and forth while it's on jack stands unless the whole front end is lifted and in the air. This allows the hub assembly to move freely side to side, which is going to be beneficial if you need to remove the CV axle or the integrated wheel end, otherwise known as IWE. Now you just need to give it a couple of whacks and the tie rod is now completely free. Now you can apply thread locker to all 4 of your wheel bearing bolts. Doing this now helps prevent you from forgetting later. That looks good. Now let's apply our grease to the inside of the hub. You don't need a lot, just make sure you cover the surface the wheel bearing will slide into. And then add some to the wheel bearing itself. You need some around the teeth like this. And also, you need to apply some in the center like this. That looks great. Alright, now change your gloves to prevent grease from getting everywhere, and then slide the wheel bearing into the hub with the ABS line at the top. Now you can begin threading your first bolt to hold the bearing in place. Once that is hand tight, grab the next bolt and do the same thing. Before you get the bolts too tight, you want to move this ABS line up and out of the way. You need to feed it around and under the dust shield. You may need to pull on the shield a little bit to get the line under it. It's probably easier if you feed the line under it before you mount the wheel bearing, but this works too, eventually. Just make sure you push this plate back or else it will rub against your rotor while you are driving. Now screw in the remaining 2 bolts by hand. Then we can grab our 18mm socket and begin tightening these down. You want to do this in a crisscross pattern. So I went from top right to the bottom left, to the bottom right, and finish with the top left. This ensures the wheel bearing is flush with the hub. Now go back over each bolt one more time before torquing them down. These need to be torqued down to 129 foot-pounds, but as I stated earlier, my bigger torque wrench is not working. So I'm going to use my impact until my new one comes in. Let's move on to the axle nut. As you can see, there is red thread locker on these nuts already. Why is this important information, you may ask? Because for some reason, I added more thread locker to this one. I think the heat started to get to me. But you can see the red thread locker in the threads of the nut already. So this is completely unnecessary. Go ahead and screw the axle nut on by hand until it won't screw anymore. Then you can grab your 13mm deep socket and begin tightening it down. You want to use a deep socket to prevent from hitting those wheel studs. Then you can grab your torque wrench and tighten it down to 30 foot-pounds. Eventually the wheel bearing will start turning with the wrench, so grab a stud with one hand as you pull in your torque wrench with the other. Just like that. Now this part is completely unnecessary, but in order to prevent any kind of moisture from rusting out the parts inside, I decided to add some grease around the axle nut. I'm thinking this helps, however I could be completely wrong. So you do what you want with this. Now, you can install your cap. Make sure it's as straight as possible before hitting it with a hammer or a mallet. That looks good. I'm going to wipe off the rest of the grease and then we can move on. Alright, go ahead and screw a lug nut all the way on to keep the rotor from moving around while installing the caliper. Then grab your caliper and place it over the rotor. You may need to give the back of the caliper a few jabs, just make sure it's lined up perfectly. Now you can grab your bolt and hopefully you already put thread locker on it before mounting the caliper, like me. This looks easy because the caliper isn't moving around, but try to remember to add thread locker before grabbing the caliper so you can immediately start threading it in. These calipers have some weight to them. Go ahead and thread the bolt in as far as you can with your fingers and then you can torque them down to 184 foot-pounds using your 21mm socket. Perfect. Now you can grab your brake hose bracket and put it into the middle slot, just like that. Then you can grab the bigger of the 2 bolts remaining and add some thread locker to it. Finger tighten it. And then grab your 10mm socket and snug it down. That should be good. Next, grab your ABS line and put this part in the hook. This will keep the line in place as you get that 8mm bolt installed. I added some thread locker to this bolt as well, but it's probably not necessary. Go ahead and grab your 8mm socket and snug it down as well. Perfect. Now we can remove any bungees or straps we still have, and then grab our ABS line and first insert the tab into here. There is another tab you need to push in this area, and you may need to filter the wire around to make it work. Then you can insert the connector into one end and then press in the red tab. Once that's connected, go ahead and press those two white tabs back through the other side of the fender liner, just like that. Next, reattach your IWE vacuum line. This should just push right in, but make sure the larger hole and smaller hole line up with the male ends of the IWE. And then you can press the tab back into the bracket. My tab is broken, as you can see, but it still holds. Now you need to apply a thin coat of anti-seize to the face of the rotor, being careful not to get any on the surface that the brake pads come in contact with. All that's left is to get your wheel back on and torque down the lug nuts to 125 foot-pounds.
That's all there is to it. If you found any part of this video helpful or entertaining, please give it a thumbs up. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button as well as the notification bell so you don't miss a video from our channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.